All right, folks, good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Looking for the Light podcast, hosted by me, Axel Hamill, and my wonderful co-host, Mike Lablev. We are now officially kicking off episode 1 of the podcast, following The Last of Us, episode 1, which is also titled, ironically, When You're Lost in the Darkness. We are going to be covering a few elements here for the episode, just like we spoke about in the last pilot episode. And for everyone's context here, if you're new to the podcast, this is a podcast by the fans of The Last of Us for the fans of The Last of Us. Those of you who have played the games in the past, and those of you who are brand new, you're more than welcome to join us here for this open forum. And the way we're going to structure our episode starting today and moving forward is talking about the episode in acts. Based on what has happened in the episode, we're going to look at the actors that are portraying the characters from the game, the world itself, and also how much does the show pay tribute to the game, right? And without further ado, just want to give a quick rundown of what the episode was before we get started. So, again, for those of you who have watched this episode, it's a long one. So it was a commitment for all of us. A good 88 minutes of viewing pleasure. Definitely worth the wait. Let's put it that way. Couldn't believe how well the episode started. Not to mention how well the intro sequence was composed. Definitely unexpected. But love how they added the factual elements of the actual cordyceps virus, which, for those of you who do not know, it's an actual fungal infection for insects. And how that would transfer over to the human population, right? It was a good segue into what The Last of Us really is, right? Getting the momentum going, and then following the wonderful intro sequence, which definitely revealed a lot about, what the fungus is, and very visually appealing, as well as the soundtrack, which is very, very much tied to what The Last of Us has used in the past. Going into, the context in the background of Sarah, portrayed really well by the actors there, as well as Joel and Tommy, and kind of that preemptive life before the outbreak, right? In the games, it's not portrayed very much in finite detail, but it kind of felt that energy, the positive energy, and the natural chemistry between these characters. Very much well done and portrayed in the show. Going into the actual outbreak itself, some differences, some similarities you can definitely see between the games and the show. The actual outbreak itself was, I would say, more dramatic in the games, but also much faster than what you'd experience in a game. There's a lot of differences you experience whenever you play the game in general, right? So watching the show was a breath of fresh air to see different perspectives, but still keeping it true to the game. And then we fast forward into, what actually happens to Sarah and all that, going into 20 years later, where Joel is now living up to the turmoil and the struggle of the past events and how much the world has degraded. A lot of differences there, and this is where it starts in terms of differences, is the last act of the show, talking about the future. We get to experience Tess. Marlene gets introduced. We finally understand what happened to Marlene, what happened to Tess, what happened to Joel, what's leading up to Ellie being part of the show, what happened to her on the Left Behind DLC. We're finally starting to get a lot more background into what happened, what we've always wondered happened, right? And that's when we end the episode, and we're going to see what happens next when we traverse into Boston. But with that being said, would love to dive deeper into Michael's perspective here as well.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Axel. That was a great introduction regarding just kind of an overview and the summary of what went down within the episode itself and what we can have as our main takeaways. First and foremost, I think one thing that I want to get right out of the books with, before we get into this is that it's the first episode, and there's definitely a lot that we can take away from it as a whole, just the way that they present the story to a audience that's going to definitely be a combination of audience of people who have never played the game and people who have played the game. So you're trying to please two totally different demographics that have, already kind of their minds made up about the show in one way or another for both sides, So, like, looking at the first introduction, there was a lot that they had to achieve, a lot of people that they had to necessarily please and impress with this. So, taking that into account, this is a really good episode. They definitely, I think, had to push a couple things very quickly and very early on within the story. There was no way that they were going to not introduce Ellie, for example, in this episode from the very beginning. Well, not from the very beginning, but at least in the very beginning, in the overview of the entire series, they had to put her in the first episode. There was so much that could have been done with just Joel, if we were to truly replicate how the game is, because you're a couple of hours into the game before you even meet Ellie, maybe about 2 hours in, almost 3 sometimes, depending on play style. But they could have spent an entire episode just to focus on Joel, just to build up that character's connection, but they couldn't. Obviously, they needed to get the second main character of the entire story in as early as possible, or else, why the heck did they? It's all about the marketing for the show as well, but. If for what the episode had to encompass itself, being that it was 81 minutes long too, and being that they were paying homage to a game, trying their best to have these adaptation of the characters, I think as a whole they did a really good job. We'll get into the nitty gritty about the specific things within these 3 different parts of the first episode, as we want to call for the cold open in Act 1. The 2003 sequence, or the Sarah sequence, the outbreak sequence as Act 2, and then 2023 as our Act 3. The modern world and the kind of the time that this story takes place in the game and as in the show, as we're gonna see. So, very, very ambitious call by Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann to really cram as much as they could in that first episode, make it all make sense, have a fluid, articulation to the viewer, but also be able to get it right and get the story in there. So let's get right into it. All right, so let's get into it talking about Act 1, the cold open for the show. Definitely something that's very different than what we've had. We never experienced this in the game. This is something strictly cinematic, strictly, artistic for them to have this kind of cue in to Dick Van Dyke, I think, type show, or a Conquerite type interview. Where the scientists are debating, the next possible pandemic, the next thing that could attack humans as a whole in 1968, excuse me. Something that I really liked about this is just the fact that it gave like an Easter egg almost effect to adding something completely new into explaining what this, fungus, this virus, this, parasite, whatever it is, to have it clearly addressed, because in the game we don't get a whole lot of it. We hear only what people talk about it, people's understanding, people knows what it does to people and what it turns them into. But what exactly is it? It's called the cordyceps virus. We know that it exists in ants, as the scientist clearly discusses about it. And the fact that, if somehow it was able to jump species because it's not used to living in a warm environment, but the globe continues to get warmer. So what if it has to adapt to just survive in a warmer environment and then it can survive on humans? What if that kind of hop was to happen? The fact that they set it up in a dramatic scene like that, I thought was really cool. I thought it was a cool way to introduce it. I heard from some of the research I did that originally they were going to do something kind of like Planet Earth-esque, like the National Geographic documentary, which Neil Druckmann watched originally. I believe it was he was a young adult or maybe even in college, which had that little snippet about the cordyceps virus, and he held on to that for years and then created the game kind of based off of that. They were going to do something of that kind of sequence where it was going to be documentary style, talking about what would happen if it was to jump over to humans. And eventually they scrapped that idea and they decided to film this instead, which I think is cool. Kind of the talk show effect of it is interesting. It gave me interesting Joker vibes. The Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, where he's sitting on that talk show with Robert De Niro, like this similar kind of dynamic. Not obviously, it was spoiler alert. Robert De Niro gets shot between the eyes by Joaquin Phoenix, but definitely not like that. But just the unease of the feeling, the interaction between the crowds, and like that kind of scene where everyone was kind of shocked by the reality like that was being spoken. It had similar calls back to me to that for me. But yeah, regarding the cold open, I definitely enjoyed it. It was very interesting to have that little, like I called it, an Easter egg addition to the story behind the cordyceps virus. Curious to hear your thoughts, Axel.
Honest opinion. Going into the intro sequence, I at first I really didn't really have a vibe for it. I don't know what it is. I personally think that having played the game and going into like the unknown was more appealing to me. I think for some reason I kind of got that. Maybe somebody else can agree with me on this. I kind of got the same I Am Legend vibe from that intro sequence. It's almost kind of like
Absolutely.
one
Absolutely. Yeah.
replication of that. So you kind of get this ominous feeling like, sure, there was a fear factor. Sure, there was kind of like this, build up to like what, foreshadowing to what's going to happen. But I also think that it was so strongly copied from the I Am Legend movie that I feel like it wasn't original, right? And everything else about the story is so original that I really just didn't feel that it was necessary to put that in there. But I think in addition to that too, the more and more I hear Mike talking about it, and I hear, folks talking about it online and how it can really apply itself to the story itself. I'm kind of understanding that the background might be necessary because for those that are brand new to the story and seeing some of the scenes in Act 2, where we talk about the actual outbreak itself, you might not understand what that actually is, right? It's not really explained until very later in the story, even in the games, right? So I think it was kind of necessary to have that background for the sake of that. But again, I think the execution of that very similar to what you'd see in I Am Legend. But at the same time, and feel free to pause me if I'm going too far ahead here, but I think when we go in from that into the actual intro sequence, like, oh my God, that was very visually appealing. That's exactly like, both the soundtrack was immaculate combined with like the showcase of the fungi, and then obviously ending with the beautiful imagery of Ellie and Joel as the the main characters of the show, like going through the sunset
and the growing fungus.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So bravo. Honestly, I think it definitely deserves its moniker for being the most appealing intro sequence, 100%. Mike, I just quickly wanted to ask you, like, from your perspective, as somebody who was appealed to that intro sequence, like, would you agree with that fact that it is kind of an I Am Legend-esque thing, or do you think that was still necessary considering that some folks might need that background?
Honestly, like, you got me thinking that the really cool thing about the I Am Legend intro was that it was very short. It was like, maybe a minute at most. And I remember, if I remember it correctly, the actual, it's like call it like a major news network, like CNN, Fox News type interview, and it's a very small box on like the entire screen, and you kind of get like a tone deaf, like audio like of that interview, and the way that it just like gives you that little snippet and then cuts to, dilapidated downtown New York City, I think that was such an impact, which was like, dang, like I Am Legend definitely had everyone's attention very quickly with the kind of intro that they had. And yeah, I totally see that similar esqueness to it, how with The Last of Us, this cold open with the interview that they're kind of doing, like I could see how they were maybe trying to go for something like that, but it's tough. It was a lot longer. it was a lot more kind of like an deeper intellectual conversation as well, because this was like, like a forum amongst professors, almost like at a university as opposed to on a talk show. I don't know if any of those like talk show hosts back then brought on guests like that, but maybe I'm completely wrong. Definitely did not do my research. But
I think another question I want to propose to the audience here as well is, do you think there'll be a cold open for every episode? Question mark?
ooh, great question. Yeah, no, just set it up maybe on Outbreak Day, or it could be in different locations or something like that, or more of a backstory to how the virus progressed. We have that snippet from one of the trailers, and some of the internet sleuths really did the digging, but it's that woman wearing a hazmat suit operating on what looks like small little cells of the fungus, and the sleuths discovered that the actress who was playing that woman in the hazmat suit is an Indonesian actress. So there's the theory out right now that the opening scene, well, they might have a cue back to, I believe, the largest bread and grain factory in the world is in Indonesia, and that maybe the fungus could have started there and eventually had spread out from export of that bad bread. Also, this is a cue in maybe to Act 2 a little early, but we'll be talking probably a little bit about the little features of Nana, the Adler family next door to the Miller family, being that Joel Miller and Sarah Miller. She was being fed bread the day before she started acting all crazy. But yeah, no, I agree with you. Just to round back real quick on the cold open, and I also really definitely want to give a nod to the title sequence for the show. Definitely big homage points for the fact that it's done very similar to how it is done in the first game as well. The first game, it is just black and white, and you just see I guess it would be like fungus sprouting, but it's almost like an X-ray view of fungus sprouting and growing and spores going everywhere. Very similar, I think, in the title sequence here. Obviously, there wasn't a very symbolic thing of Joel and Ellie having these little, like, almost antenna-like pieces to the fungus. But, it's the same song, exactly the same. Gustavo absolutely kills it on the soundtrack for the show throughout with the cues and music. It's beautiful, and they only had a couple of songs that were not original to The Last of Us in this episode. So I'm sure we're gonna have some great music. We'll probably talk about some of the cues in that we're already seeing from 60s, 70s, and 80s genre music playing on the radio. So will be awesome to see more of that in the future. But without further ado, let's move on to the next act by traveling to 2003. So now we're talking about stuff that actually did happen for the most part, right? We have a little bit more of a cue in. Like the game starts out in the evening. We start this show right off with Sarah waking up. So we see that day, Joel's birthday, from the morning instead of starting it basically in the last couple of hours of that actual day. Really cool to see kind of this build in, the relationship that Joel and Sarah already have. Obviously, she's in her teens. He seems to be a single father. We get more kind of like a context of a background, not so much about like, what his story is entirely, but we almost know more about Tommy in a way than we do about Joel right from the get-go. We know that Joel has a daughter. We know that he's turning 36. We know that he works in construction, and we know that he lives in Austin, Texas, and he seems to be a single father. We know his brother is a veteran of Desert Storm. Looked like he was in a tank division, and also works with him in construction. We get kind of that backstory to it. We see kind of the world almost rapidly, but at the same time, it seems mundanely ramp up very quickly. It seems as though we get hints throughout the episode as well of the outbreak, the looming outbreak when it seems to all kind of culminate at night, right? So it's very interesting to see how they build out that world. But just initial responses to the characters themselves, how characters are being portrayed by the actors. Definitely very believable, very good. In the sense that I can tell that they put a lot just into their own artistic portrayal. I'm not a professional actor, so I'll not critique them to that extent. But it's believable. The character flow goes well, obviously it's not one-to-one with the game, but there's a lot of calls to the game, a lot of direct quotes that are pulled directly from the game originally into it. Yeah, they kick it off really well. We see, a little bit more about Sarah getting the watch repaired, which was honestly a minor detail that I didn't even really catch on with. I thought it was a brand new watch, to be honest with you. I think I never caught on to the fact that she said she was getting it fixed for him. But great to, get more of also a backstory, I guess, on Tommy there. With why Joel was outside the house. I think this is where it differs from the game. Joel could have been investigating something in the game as opposed to in the show. He's going to bail out Tommy. Seems like Tommy is the more rambunctious one as opposed to, Joel, though we don't know much about Joel and Tommy's background whatsoever in the game. So yeah, it's interesting to see how they build out the characters and show them, even prior to when the horde comes, if you will, when the outbreak really happens, So the character portrayals there are good, and the build up to the scariness, with the Adler family living next door and the Nana being the one that gets infected. The theory could be that it's because they take her downtown. I mention again the theory online is that it could be through the bread or something like that, but let alone Sarah, Joel, and Tommy, they're not infected. So as things go down, the portrayal, the darkness of it, the cues inside the car as they're escaping, it's all befitting with it. I don't want to steal the summary of it, but the portrayal of it all is very accurate, very cool. The whole blending of the characters, the homage as well, and the world that it set. It was all believable. It was all good, and it was really cool to see how they adapted it to the show, and honestly making it look a lot like the game. I guess it's cool to have it in the very beginning because it panders to the video game audience in a sense, because it shows them one-to-one recreation, and for our audience basically, it should be really cool to see them do that. I hope that they don't keep that up throughout the entire show. I hope that they do stick more to the cinematic parts of it, because some of the cinematic parts in the Last of Us video game are some of the best cinematic parts in video games, period. So I hope that they build off on that a little bit more. But the little Easter eggs of the restaurant that Joel and Sarah run through before the soldier. The actual portrayal of the soldier was kind of interesting, as opposed to more of a ruthless killer cyborg. Axel, that was something that I know that you wanted to bring up, but yeah, I'm definitely curious to hear your take for the 2003 Act 2 of this episode.
Well, first of all, that's another key element we need to consider. It takes place in 2003. For any player of the original Last of Us, we know that didn't take place in 2003. It took place in 2013. So, with that being in mind, keeping that in mind, let's consider that there are elements here that need to keep really accurate if you're going to do that, right? Number one thing, weapons. Number two, items. Number three, what we're wearing. It has to be historically accurate. Technology, right. I mean, the whole shebang, right? Everything changes when you change timelines. Neil had a really good reason for this. We're going to get into it when we get to Act 3. But think about it this way. What has happened in society in the last couple of years? Why is it so relevant for us to have this story take place now versus, in the future, right? We're kind of experiencing a pandemic of our own, right? So I think there's some creative interests here to have it launched right now. So with that being said, 2003, I love the fact that we now hone in on the characters and their portrayal of and their chemistry You know, Sarah, Joel, right? Who are they as father and daughter, right? And Tommy, how did they interact with each other? All we really knew in the games was they were, you know, obviously they lived together, you know, in the same roof, but they were family. But you know, we really kind of get into the action right away. We don't really understand what the chemistry was like. What was life before everything went to, for lack of a better term, shit, right?
Right.
And I think we kind of get a glimpse of that. We also understand now that Tommy was a bit of a troublemaker as a character, right? He landed in jail for being a drunk, right? And I think that was actually comically interesting because I think Tommy and Joel are such like-minded people, and they're very straight-edged in the games that it's hard to imagine them having like comical behavior, right, in the show. So that was very interesting. Also, like the fact you mentioned about the watch. I mean, the fact that Sarah went and purposely got the watch fixed shows that there was even more like personal feelings towards that gift, right? And really glad they added that detail multiple times in the show. Not just the fact that it was a gift, but you know, the background behind the watch, giving the watch, and then when obviously, you know, Joel wearing the watch for the rest of the season. So I think that's really critical for us to keep in mind, that there's still a memento for Sarah's gift. And then I think Mike hit this in the nail really well about sort of the background behind the virus. I'd be interested to know what the little Easter eggs there are, but my theory is similar to yours, where we're looking at a world where the fungus should have originated somewhere, and the fact that they went downtown, like the Nana went downtown, had to be a reason for her personally to get infected. But think about some of the visual elements here. Again, I think one-to-one replication of the outbreak happening, Sarah waking up in her room, nobody being in the house, going outside. Interesting to see that they showed sort of the infection cycle a little bit in Nana's house. And again, big difference. The fungus and the infection of the virus is no longer airborne. You can see the tentacles coming out of people's mouths.
Man, it's just crazy the way that they're making, you know, this artistic liberty that they're taking with kind of redoing the fungus, I think. It's not something that we saw in the game originally, you know, like this is also like a kind of new thing. This is a new, obviously with the spores not existing anymore, there's also a deviation from the game. But the fact that they're now cutting out, they're this new addition of like these weird hair looking tentacle follicles, whatever, coming out of their mouth. It's interesting. It is very creepy. So I'm like on board with it. And it's got me freaking out and definitely not wanting to look at them, but it is different from the game. And it's for now it's okay. The sports thing, we talked about it in the last episode. I need an explanation why Nick Offerman, excuse me, why Bill is wearing a gas mask. So, and I get it. You know, they went into a room also in the next chapter. They go into a room that is congested, and what would have been congested was spores because of the body that's morphed to the wall. But in the game that would have been definitely done with a mask. So that's something, further to talk about. But yeah, creepy, man. Creepy. So I take it that you like it as well, or not so much?
I think it was an interesting addition to sort of the storyline. I think to cater for a television series, it might have probably been a much more expensive option to create spores like that. I think also to fully understand the transfer of the virus visually and make it more gruesome, I think that made a lot more sense, again, for the background. What I truly enjoyed too was that they stayed true to the game's visualization when it came to the infected family running out of the house and infecting the neighbor. Just like in the games, very similar. And then again, when we're in the car with Ellie, you have that same feel from the camera perspective, that you have the ability to look all over what's happening. You see the house burning down. You see everybody frantically trying to escape the city, doing the same exact thing. The military intercepting that. And then you rush into town, and while again there are a lot more, there's more an emphasis of a wider outbreak instead of a more regional outbreak. Like in the games, you see a freaking airplane come down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that's taking it a step up, right? And just like you mentioned, I think going straight into the end of Act 2, where we're talking about the climax between Joel and the soldier, and what I wanted to portray here with the soldier, I think that was the most sincere way of showing that, this person, the soldier that shot Sarah ultimately, was just not a heartless monster. Like, he was told to do that. He even multiple times asked if that was an order, and it was,
right.
and he had to carry out that order. Granted, I think they perfected the scene with Sarah and the frantic turmoil that Joel was going through. But at the end of the day, I think that was so well summarized for Act 2. I think that was an amazing way to, I guess, reapply the old schematic of The Last of Us origins, right? So
For sure.
Kudos to Neil and Craig for directing this episode, and Act 2 was just chef's kiss, honestly. So
Yeah, no, it was the finale, it's like the finale to Act 2, if you will, and the homage that they do to it. I will say I wish that the soldier said more than yes, sir, like 5 times before he just puts the gun on Joel and Sarah and pulls the trigger. Then again, yeah, the I'm sorry adds like a level of depth. You can hear his tone change in the tone of voice every time he says yes, sir. But I feel like you felt it more in the game, and he actually. It seemed like he didn't want to take the order in the game to fire those shots, but maybe being a little bit too nitpicky on that, because the real most important thing is Sarah gets shot and how mainly Joel reacts to it and cradles her, and then Tommy does play a big part in that as well in that finale. I think it was very well done in homage to the game. Definitely very honest, very similar. I give big shout out, I think, to Tommy. I really like his portrayal by Gabriel Luna. I think Pedro Pascal did a good job. I watched the original. I'll definitely be biased. I think the original, the game, Troy Baker's performance is better, but Pedro Pascal still does a really good job. I'll give him that for sure. But yeah, no, great finale to it, and then the quick cut scene. 20 years later, boom, we're now in Boston, and we're a kid traversing on the outside, clearly infected, like tweaking a little bit when he's walking, dragging his leg. You can kind of surmise that, the more and more I've been reading into this whole cordyceps virus, the more like I'm seeing how this kind of like actions that are similar in ants, we're seeing a very similar portrayal in humans in this game, how it inhibits the body and then causes tremors, causes to like insane hallucinations and disassociation. So it seems pretty fitting with the kid, and we see the classic direct re-representation of the scanners that the federal soldiers are using, and we're seeing it all within a lens of 20 years in the future. So Boston completely bombed out, only having the fortress pretty much standing there. Very similar to the game. They were portraying it all to alike with, setting the world for what Boston is in the 20 years in the future, technically 2023. So paying, a little bit of metaphorical context to what you were alluding to, Axel. But very cool to see the fact that Boston looks a lot similar to it does in the game, particularly that in the game with the maps that you can find, you'll see that in the early stages of the outbreak, there was a very fortified Boston quarantine zone that was set up. And then there was a range of about, I think it's like a third of a mile or half a mile that the military straight bombed. That's why you see so many of those buildings knocked over and a lot of territory flattened. So that way there's like a buffer zone between heavily infested and, potentially infected Boston and then the city itself, the quarantine zone. And you'll see a lot of that also, I think, as Ellie and Joel traverse the country, and then in part two, with Seattle being a big theme and a big setting in the game, you see very similar tactics that Fedra and the military had taken very early on in like these large quarantine zones that were set up throughout the country to basically scorch earth for about, I'm pretty sure it's like a quarter of a mile or half a mile, so that way there's as much clear line of sight as you can. There's no obstructions to the view for the military as they're protecting their quarantine zone. So cool to see. We get more context later on in the episode about where the world is as far as resources. We see them bartering with ration cards, which are the same from the video game as well. We see that the prevalence of vehicles is very low. We also see that car batteries, are hard to come by. So it's very similar to what is portrayed in the game. The world seems to be portrayed pretty well overall. I'm excited to see what it's going to look like throughout the game. We're just getting the context right now of Boston, and we'll see what greater Boston looks like in the episodes to come in the future. I'm sure of it. One thing, though, that I do want to hark on, which is going to get a negative grade for me in my review for this first episode, is the inclusion of a helicopter. Like, this is just, I didn't catch it, I'll be honest, in the very first run of the show. But when I was doing the second run of the show for myself, I had the closed captions on, and I saw it said at the bottom, helicopter hovering in the distance. I was livid when I saw that, and I didn't realize it, but I was looking at it again when the infected child is standing at the foot of like this hill, seeing the whole view of Boston, the quarantine zone, and this whole scorched earth in between. You see helicopters hovering over the quarantine zone. That is something that the diehard Last of Us fan inside of me got very pissed off to see. There's no way that they would be flying helicopters. I'm not saying that it's not impossible for them not to have access to maybe some helicopters that are still functioning if they had good maintenance and such for the last 20 years. But just flying a helicopter just to fly a helicopter or to do patrols in this world doesn't make sense, especially a helicopter that's a gas guzzler. And when you're living in a world where finding a good battery, a vehicle battery, is hard to come by. So that was something that irked me. I honestly have the feeling that was a mistake made in post-production, where someone who was doing the CGI editing for the episode probably got some instructions and just figured that adding a helicopter and some helicopter sound bites was going to be okay.
Thumbs up to should we get a thumbs up to fire this person?
Yeah, well, definitely put them on paid leave, though.
That's right.
Or at least have them correct this issue, because this, to me, if a helicopter never comes up in the show again, like there's never going to be a point in the game, or excuse me, in the show where the characters are going to be chased by a helicopter, or they're going to be avoiding spotlights from a helicopter, then that is something that they need to do the exact same thing that they did with Game of Thrones, and I believe the last season and the first couple of episodes, where hilariously all over Twitter, people were resharing pictures of the Starbucks cups and the water bottles that didn't get edited out of the shots for the Game of Thrones. So I think it's going to be something, if it never comes up, then they got to go back in there and just edit that crap out, because that just kills it for the immersion. Never in the game do you see any helicopters. Never is there any illusion that they even have access to stuff like that, if that even still exists in the game. Vehicles are hard to come by, but then again, factions like the WLF had quite a number of vehicles, but they clearly took very good care of them, and they were all military vehicles for the most part. But yeah, that just kind of kills the immersion for me, and that might be a very small slip up of some intern, but at the same time, I I hope that they can fix that because just for me, they kill it. But outside of that, the world seemed very good. The characters, let's call it like that, in the world, as far as how they, their portrayal of the world themselves, quite a few dirty people, quite a few clean people. I don't know if it's just because there is that dynamic in Boston where they are in a quarantine zone. Some certain people do have access to, like, say, good self-hygiene. I'm a very big stickler on that, but we were talking about it in the last episode. If I see clean people wearing dirty clothes, and it's very lopsided, then it looks kind of funny. But Robert is one character that stood out to me. But then again, Robert's kind of like a local, local like leader, if gang leader is a more appropriate term, maybe, lead smuggler or something along those lines, leads merchant. So the fact that he's like wearing jewelry and and it seems to be pretty well kept is maybe alluding to the fact that he's wealthy and he has access to good things in this world. But as opposed to everybody else, seems pretty raunchy. I do like the way that they are portraying federal military for the most part. They look very, very scrappy. Their stuff looks like it's just a piecing together of a bunch of old, decrepit gear and stuff. So they're kind of keeping it real to that. So for the most part, that looks pretty cool. The plate carriers did catch me off guard a little bit. I think I saw a couple of rather modern plate carriers, but that's just me and me being a hardcore stickler. But yeah, as a whole, the world's looking pretty cool. Definitely been hearing a lot of people talking about it on the internet, saying like it. Some people saying it looks a little too real, like too manicured, too overgrown. But let's see how it goes throughout the rest of the series. But thus far in this in the first episode, the world as a whole is pretty cool. But get those helicopters out.
Right. So the last thing we want in a post-apocalyptic world is helicopters to have an unfair advantage, right? But anyway, so the year is now 2023. There's a creative reason for that. The fact that we are set in a parallel universe in our current year signifies that, trying to build some kind of parallel to what we're experiencing now in our own world with COVID and the pandemic that we've had in a few these last couple of years. So definitely good correlation there. The pieces that I want to hone into more so because I think Mike did an excellent job honing in on the world and the tribute to the game. I wanted to hone in on some of the character development here. So I alluded to this earlier, but at this point of the show, we're essentially very separate from what the game was all about, right? This is the portion where we are actually seeing things we've never seen before. Number one, Ellie, right? Ellie comes in hot at the very beginning of this act, right? Ellie is chained to a wall at what we call the Fireflies, which are the faction that rebellious faction to find, to reclaim humanity, essentially, right? And Ellie's chained up in a wall at the Firefly compound. Why, you ask? You won't find that out until the end of the season. However, Ellie is there for a reason because she was found somewhere else, right? She was essentially saved by the leader of the Fireflies, and that's Marlene, right? Marlene was portrayed really well in a show. This is something I always wanted to find out, especially in the games and going into the show, is how did she get injured prior to meeting Joel and Ellie? And this is kind of where we start to see Joel and Chet and Tess and their personal relationship as well on the flip side, right? So in the games, there's some background alluding to their relationship and their romantic involvement there, but we finally start to see that on screen, and how they would live together, they would sleep together. Clearly, there's something going on between them. And even Tess going so far as to say, "I got him. I got him. Don't worry, Robert. I got him." Right? Robert being the leader of another rebel group there. So, or you probably say the underground corrupted group there. But Ellie's story is interesting because at first she doesn't really understand what she's doing there. So Ellie starts to get an idea of, she needs to keep some things a secret, but the Fireflies are keeping her there for a reason, right? And this is where we started to see the separation between the story and the characters within the third act is, we have Joel, who's really desperate trying to find Tommy, whereas in the games he really doesn't mind too much about his brother. It's kind of like his brother exists, but, could care less where Tommy is. In the show, you can see Joel very desperate to find where Tommy is, even going so far as to literally find a car battery. And then we have Marlene, who was injured from a fight between Robert and his goons over a car battery, right? So now we have essentially this crossroads of destiny between Joel, Tess, Ellie, and Marlene, and getting Ellie to where she needs to go west to meet the other Firefly factions, right?
Right.
So we get to the end of the climax of the first episode. We have this corrupted soldier who is about to shoot Ellie. Joel has a moment of inner turmoil, thinking about his own daughter and how he failed to protect her. And I think it was natural instinct for him to come into action, which not completely separate from the game. Love that they added that on there. Love that they added that personal element on there. Kudos to them. And the fact that Joel got his first redemption to his daughter's death was incredible. I mean, I think as a fan and as a first-time viewer, you can definitely see that the emotional discharge of that moment was sincere, right? And
sure.
We finally find the truth about Ellie. She is infected. She has a bite mark that's several weeks old, right? And we start to understand, okay, maybe there's more to this girl than meets the eye. And this is where we start the real story between Joel and Ellie, right? And getting to where she needs to go. And love that they hinted at the end that there's a clicker sound for episode 2 because, as we all know, the man himself will be directing the next episode, Infected, which will be taking place in the Boston skyline. So any player of the game knows that this is by far one of the best visually appealing scenes of the game, and really understand what it's like to stay in the dark, right? And as the title of this episode is summarizing perfectly, when you're lost in the darkness, right? Look for the light, and that's explaining the dynamic between the Fireflies and the rest of the world, right? So I think that was really perfectly portrayed, aside from random helicopters. Again, wherever you are, you should have thought twice on that. And I also love the fact that we got some ominous feeling around the importance of the radio and the 70s, 60s, and 80s music that we hear at the end as well, which signifies trouble. So
can I interject real quick? And when we're talking about, maybe I wanted to hint a little bit at our hopes for where we go as well with that the next episode, the Infected, as you call it. Can we be in agreement? Is that Bill that he's communicating with via the radio with the 60s, 70s, and 80s songs? I'm convinced it's Bill. That seems to me like something that that Bill would be able to communicate. I mean, like, new shipment in, nothing new, and something bad is going on. I think that's new shipment in. That screams Bill right there, right? So I think unnaturally where Joel is potentially thinking of as well for the next bit is what's the backup plan once they get outside the wall? The safest place to go would be the Bills. So yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, that probably makes the most sense logically, because who else would have a car battery? If it's not in the Boston QZ, the only person who has even access remotely to vehicles would be Bill, right? And that's yet to be seen, but I think that's, considering the events that we're about to see in the future, I think logically it makes sense for it to be Bill, 100%. But asking the fans as well, drop your comments. Definitely want to hear what you think is on the sending end of that radio signal.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of questions to ask and be answered where we can go. What's Joel's thing with Tommy? It's taking steps away from the game, and creating its own plot points as well. But it's definitely going to be interesting how it sees. Definitely excited for the second game, and definitely excited to discuss this further next week. But I think overall for this first episode, it's tough for me to put a final grade on it because I think one element that makes me grade it also a little bit down is, we're catering to an audience for The Last of Us fans, right? I mentioned it in the beginning. There's also those people watching the show who have never played the video game at all, and for them, I can totally see this first episode, the second half of it, starting I think with Act 3, being a little too rushed for them. Introducing Joel, what his life is in the quarantine zone, Tess, Marlene, and Ellie all blended into about 30, 40 minutes of content. That's pretty tough to do. So I can see it being low for them. The helicopters kind of bring it down for me as well. And they're setting up the course for how slight elements of this show I think are going to be different. And I think, that all kind of plays into the homage in the story, both to good and some bad. But, I think the casting is great. The direction is great. The portrayal is going pretty good so far. So I'm giving it an 8.99. That's what I'm giving it. Like an 89.9%, like a B++. Can't give it an A- because honestly, I think it could have been done better. Now, that's the Last of Us gamer side of me. It could have been done better. Give Joel a whole episode all to himself, the first one. Introduce Ellie in the second. I know exactly how this is going. I can sit through and enjoy an entire episode of just Joel. That would have made it more creep into the A section for me. But for where it's going right now, 8.99.
So, from my perspective, I think there's a lot of elements here that if you look at the categories where we're talking about the actors, the world, and the tribute to the game itself, we have a world that has shifted in timeline, number one. We have a world that is not entirely accurate to the timeline. We also have differences to the tribute of the game, some for better, some for worse. The way that the virus is transmitted is different, but maybe more visually appealing. I also think that the way that they essentially gave some more context around the characters and their crossroads in a future setting was interesting, but I also think that some elements may have been somewhat unnecessary or a little bit more weighted. So with that being said, drum roll please. The final score from my end is also a B-. Sorry, B+. B+.
Yeah.
I had A- in my mind, but actually realistically we're going to go with B+. So 89% overall for the first episode. I think it was a very valuable insight into what can be done for the series. But there's still a lot of room to grow. Again, this is a brand new director for the series. We'll see a much more different artistic direction for the next episode. So one from the original creator, Neil Druckmann himself. So would love to hear people's predictions to the episode, what we expect to see with the character development, the world itself, and the tribute to the game moving forward. Thank you all for joining our podcast today. Again, this has been Looking for the Light podcast, hosted by Axel Hamill with the co-host Michael Abelev. Love sharing our thoughts with you all. Please comment your predictions for the next episode come Sunday. And as always, when you're lost in the darkness,
keep looking for the light, homies. All right. See you guys next week.